In this section, we will discuss finding your first paying customer. Let me start with the caveat that while I will utilize a case study to really show you the nuts and bolts of this process, these concepts apply whether you're starting a startup venture or you're in a large company and the company's division has asked you to expand the market into a new area or with a new product. The lessons still apply, and really honing in on what the customer wants and hearing them is the reason for large companies in the past to have been so successful. Let's begin. Today, I'll be using the case study of Pillpack, and I want to take a moment here to talk about why, and I also really want to pay attention to this photo on the right-hand side. So, Pillpack is any other company, but the reason it's interesting is it takes what we've learned so far about software design, engineering, prototyping, and kind of brings it together in the best way with a story that 99% of startups or even intrapreneurial ventures, as we call them within large companies, may not accomplish. I want you to hone in on the middle of the picture. Doesn't it look like a roll of toilet paper? So, what it is it's tablets that are pre-marked, if you look on the top right, for the time of day and the day itself, and pre-packaged with the medications that you need to be taking. But the reason I showed you that photo and went into such detail in terms of the layout is because Pillpack is a great story. It's a story that starts with a pharmacy student and an MIT Sloan business student coming together at a startup party to talk about innovative ideas. And TJ, the pharmacy student, says, "My family's been in the pharmacy business for generations," and proceeds to relay that there are still, as this was written many years ago, many pharmacies and pharmacists that are eyeballing the number of pills that go into the bottle, and that many of the inaccuracies of patients taking their medication has to do with the fact that they rely more on color than what's written in indescribable font on the pill, and also rely more on a relative or a friend when they're on a lot of medications to put them into the individual pill packs that you see selling at the pharmacy. So they took this idea and they basically, as you can see on the left and right hand side, said, what is the simplest way that we can design packaging to make this into a business? And what would you do if you were traveling on a trip? You would just unfurl this roll of easy to peel toilet paper, because you know what? Toilet paper is something everyone's familiar with. Throw it in your bag for a trip or pass it off to your father and say, here's your medicine for the next 7 days. I'll see you next weekend. Let's fast forward. So Pillpack did follow what we already discussed, which is about 10 years ago, there was a few things that were happening. On the top left, 34M refers to the 34 million prescriptions in the United States that were written yearly for prescription medication. And of those, on the right top, it denotes that 50% were not utilized. So within 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, there is plenty of data that we won't get into here. But let's just say globally, most patients stop taking their prescription medication, and this data reflects the number in the United States approximately 10 years ago. Then, on the bottom left, once they understood that there's a big problem with compliance of taking your medication, they started to stratify the market, and we'll talk about how they got there, but the 100 billion certainly represents a big enough problem that they should attack it. And finally, on the bottom right, and this will be so relevant, there were over 700,000 places, pharmacies from which you could get your medication. And the experience differed dramatically. Now, why is this important? In our last lecture, we covered really identify the problem. So as they thought about, as discussed in the case study, what is the problem? The problem is not simply seeing the physician, getting the prescription, making it to the pharmacy, but that target niches, once you get to a pharmacy physically or one of the mail orders mails it to you, it remains a confusing process. You don't know which pills to keep taking, which pills to stop, and when they should end. And they figured this out how? Remember, we talked about design thinking? One of the co founders visited his dad on a weekend and saw that he was there and he spilled his 7-day pill pack on the floor. And there was such confusion about, oh, shoot, where am I going to take these pills and put them back in? I think the pink ones I usually take in the evening and the blue ones I usually take in the mornings, which is honestly what a lot of patients tell us because it's complicated. When he saw that that actually happened, Elliot knew it's time to take this to the market. We have interviewed hundreds of people. Let's see how we can get paid for this. So the pain point, to reiterate the importance, is that the patient wants their symptoms to be under control, but has to do other things, such as work and family, over just figuring out what pills they need to be on. Now, here is an example of the first patient that they felt might be their customer, and I'll show you later how that process got iterated. Okay, will we be selling to the elderly patient as described, the father, the mother, the grandmother who's unable to keep track and has a pill bottle? Sometimes they take the medicine. Most times, elderly folk do not even want to be labeled as sick. And so there's this emotional component. Not only now do I have to admit that I'm sick, but I have to take medicine to be well. And one of the reasons they cite for compliance being down is I try to take it when I'm feeling bad. And when my blood pressure feels a little better, I stop taking my medication for a few months. And that is an emotional component that they learned by visiting people that were on multiple medications and sitting in pharmacies in the back and hearing the patient's stories. So then they continued. And what we had designed at one of the hacking medicine institutes at MIT is really a concept that I want to discuss here, but it does not matter which framework you use. They're all very similar in the startup world. The first thing you want to do is break the problem into its component parts, which I feel will be very utilitarian for software engineers, designers, scientists who are listening to this lecture because it gives you a framework to start with. I want you to look at the left, the users, the stakeholders, the payers. I've already taught you how do you identify the user, whose problem are you solving. Any answer will do to start. Then you will make your stakeholder map, find out who really influences which pharmacy they go to and who fills their prescriptions. And finally, the payers. The payers are important because, as we discussed in healthcare, the customers or the people that pay are often not the users. Now let's go to the stuff that may not be intuitive on the right of the slide. What do they need and what do they want? And this is very important because what we say we want may not necessarily be what we need to solve the problem. It isn't simply, as they initially thought at Pillpack, that they just needed a robotic, accurate counting system or to bring in manufacturing, as is done in other industries, for regulation of how many pills are in a bottle. That wouldn't have simply solved their problem, even though that was easy for them to figure out. In addition, what they needed to accuracy was a reason for people to reach for their pill packet and be able to take the right medicine at the right time. How did they accomplish this? Well, the next part of this model in particular, and again, any framework that you've been taught will work, but this is a good one because it's, again, very systematic in terms of the questions that you have to answer. So look at the questions. This should be second nature now. Your goal is to improve what? Whose quality will you improve? Who will have access to your product? And the list goes on. Then you go to our first target customer is. Don't be afraid to write it down. It can be wrong. You can change it later. But you want to write down what they're suffering from and what you're improving. And then finally, we talk about early adopters at the bottom. So Pillpack did hundreds and hundreds of interviews and then literally sat down and said, how would we answer these questions? And what you can see here is the answers to the questions. So part of this will look familiar. Managing multiple medications, the quality of the experience at the pharmacy. Let's stop there for a moment. If anyone is familiar with going to the pharmacy, in the United States, for example, and this may differ in different parts of the world as the retail pharmacies in the United States have grown in size. It's often a very impersonal and frustrating experience. And what I mean by that is you show up, lots of people are waiting in line, everyone needs their medications right away. So what do? You go ahead, you browse the aisles, and the strategy is you will hopefully buy a few things that you didn't really come in with. This actually works great for the pharmacy model. But when they look at consumer ratings of satisfaction and experience, pharmacies were often being rated at the lowest out of the 50 types of industries. So, what Pillpack was able to match was you have a need for your medication, and the current experience is terrible. So, if you remember the graph or the scale I showed you with the very unhappy red face, that is often what people look like if they have to make one or two trips to the pharmacy. And all Pillpack was trying to do is get them to that happy green. How can I get you your medications in a timely way without having to wait at the pharmacy? So let's return to their answers. Here's what I want you to pay attention to. The first target customer, after many interviews, did not end up being the 60, 70, 80-year-old on multiple medications as they had started, and also did not end up being the natural pill market where there were a lot of supplements. It ended up being 20 to 40-year-olds taking multiple medications activated from a recent illness or a chronic condition who I think they say it best, but the problem is the experience of going to the retail pharmacy is terrible. It sucks. So why go with the 20 to 40-year-olds, you ask? Well, look at the last line, a very key line as you identify your customers. They will be early adopters because they're busy and they're not change averse. So what that means is if you can find a motivated customer that's willing to change the way they do things, you will do much better than finding hundreds of customers who are very married to the way they do things. And I think by lowering the age and saying all of these people already shop on their phone or look at social media or do their banking online and are comfortable and trust that process, are more likely to trust the digital health aspect. So how did they make it better? That is the third part of this iterative process. Well, they looked at comparables. One of the companies that was also coming onto the market was called glow caps, a simple concept. Well, we'll know if patients take their medication because a light will signal every time the cap is opened. Now, I don't know if any of you that are listening today have had patients, but I will tell you that my patients can often open the cap, throw the pills out, and say, I'll be honest, doc, I bring the empty bottle because I don't want my primary care doc to feel bad. Or there's stories of, I put my CPAP machine on my pet, otherwise the insurance company will take it away if I don't wear it every night. It's not that I'm telling these stories to be punitive. What I'm saying is we have to hear what the patients are saying. There's something about the process that isn't working for them. So I think the glow caps, what it really did was showed that there is a market for adherence and that it's important that we think about the compliance. Another company that took the corollary of that concept and said not only should you take your pills, but other folks should celebrate and reward it. And there's almost like an encouragement community within their app that says, you're doing a great job, you've taken your medications, and that's what you need to be doing. And hopefully it'll help you along other spheres of your life. And again, this showed Pillpack that there's definitely an appetite for a sense of community when you're feeling sick and you're having to take medications to begin with. So, making it better, what Pillpack was able to accomplish, let's go back and think about the several things they did. They found a problem with a fairly large market that was quite specific. How do I know when to take my pills and which pills to take, knowing that I'm an activated, motivated user but I'm a very busy person. I don't have time to think about it, and they're tough to identify on their own. They created this tearaway sachet and said, it'll be quite easy for you to know. You'll just tear it off and take it with you to work or have it for your parents at home. Or eventually, they were able to scale it to all maybe 47 to 48 states before they encountered their competition. So the second part they answered was who was their customer. And since we're discussing the paying customer, the most important evolution of Pillpack was that they were able to get on the insurance plans. Once they got on the insurance plan, something very interesting happened. The CVS, the Walmart, the Walgreens of the world took interest, didn't appreciate it, didn't enjoy it. Suddenly they were competition. They went from a small, custom, niche mail order pharmacy to something geographically spread across the United States. The reason I tell this story is that the behind the scenes play of Pillpack, customers loving them, came into play. They were then promptly dropped from some insurance plans at the behest of some large companies that said, well, how do we know they're really accurately providing the pills? How do we know they're timely? And how did they combat that? They didn't go argue with the large pharmacies, their competitors. They went to their customers, and their customers wrote hundreds and hundreds of letters to Congress, to senators. There were several customers who were in Congress who were utilizing it for themselves and for loved ones who said, we do have the choice, and they have shown that they're accurate. In fact, their manufacturing takes the human error out of it when they're closing the sachet. And so Pillpack got on the formulary and eventually got acquired. The reason I use this story is we started with how do you find your customer? But in order to find your customer, you have to be very cognizant of the environment and not be afraid to have those first few customers take them with you on your journey, because those first few advocates, big or small, will be the ones that will help you to bring your business back. I think now, speaking to the founders, they will say there were many times that their company nearly died, but they evolved. And some companies may die and you may start a different one, or your project venture in your large company may die, but you've shown your bosses that you have the skills to take these ventures forward, and it will allow you to do a better job in your next entrepreneurial journey.